Our study is about language acquisition, so we're looking at that very first step, so how infants are able to figure out what the words in their language are, as opposed necessarily to what those words mean. So what we're doing is we've created an artificial language, and it's made up of 4 what we consider to be words, which each have 2 syllables. And we're looking at a pattern called vowel harmony, and that means that within that language, within the words, the vowels have a shared property or characteristic. So when that property changes, and it's a vowel that doesn't fit, it must be a new word. And so what this is about is trying to see if that cue, vowel harmony, might be something that infants are looking for when they're trying to separate out words in their language. And we do the study with English acquiring infants. So English actually is not a language that has vowel harmony in it. So what's really cool about that is that when we see a difference, that infants do pay more attention to what we consider to be words, which are those with vowel harmony, or part words which don't have the harmony. We're able to tell that this is something that could be innate, a tool that all infants are born with across the world, since they've never actually been exposed to that pattern before. So that's kind of what our study is about here. We use something called the head-turn preference procedure, and what that means is that the infant is seated on their mother's lap, and we're able to see them in our monitoring room, and we're playing them sounds and showing them some flashing lights. And so after they're exposed to the familiarization stream where they hear those patterns over and over again, we start playing them one word over and over, or a part word over and over. And it'll come out of one side of the speaker with a flashing light in that direction. So the infant will turn their head and kind of pay attention to it. And when they grow bored, they'll look away. They don't want to listen to it anymore. And that's kind of what we're measuring, which sounds they like to listen to more. It's more of a measure of attention than anything else. So especially at 7 months, they do have a fairly short attention span, so they're only going to want to listen to things that they're interested in. So by measuring whether they pay more attention to either what we consider to be words or part words, we're able to tell that they make a distinction between the 2. So what we're looking at is that first step, which is how they are able to separate words when they listen to other people speak. Okay. How do they pick out what the words are as opposed to picking somewhere in the middle or anything like that. So if you think about listening to a foreign language, now it's very hard to figure out what the words could possibly be, let alone what they mean. So that's kind of what our experiment is looking at, and many things have been shown to be indicators within a language. That's actually what he was listening to. Oh wow, okay. Kind of weird like that. Things like stress, pausing, intonation, things like that.
The general research question that we're looking at is how infants initially start to figure out what the words of their language are. And this is something that you and I take for granted, speaking our native language. We know when words are beginning and when words are ending. We don't even give it a second thought. This is something that has been notoriously difficult to get computers to do. And you can sort of imagine why when you put yourself, or appreciate why when you put yourself in a situation of listening to someone speaking a foreign language that you've had no exposure to. It, first of all, it sounds like they're talking very quickly, and it sounds like you can't really tell where words begin and end. And that actually is a related phenomenon. It sounds like they're talking quickly because you're working so hard to try to do something that normally we do automatically. And so if you think about what the situation of an infant is when they're learning their language, is they're basically listening to a foreign language, and they have to figure out where words begin and end, and they have to figure out what are very useful indicators in their language for beginnings and ends of words.
So what this is a nonsense language that we've made up. It's made of 4 2-syllable words, what we call words, which have harmony. Okay. And so what he's listening to is 90 seconds of that stream over and over and over again. Okay. So it's kind of like his exposure to the language. Okay. And then what we're doing is we're playing him what we consider to be words, which are those 2 syllables, or part words, which is heard equally as often, but it would be the second syllable and the first syllable of another word combined. Oh, okay. So they have a different vowel.
Like the end and the beginning of one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Exactly. So what we're doing is we're playing either one of those repeatedly or an actual word repeatedly. And we're listening to see which, if he pays more attention to one or the other, which would show that he had indicated one as a word and one is not a word.
It's not. Okay.
Exactly. And what's interesting... Sorry,
go ahead.
Oh, what's interesting is we use children who are acquiring English as a language because English does not have vowel harmony. which is kind of
okay.
cool. So even though numerous languages across the world do have vowel harmony, English doesn't. So these children have never been exposed to it before, and yet they're still able to make that distinction. In our experiments in the past, we have actually noticed that they do make a distinction between the two different kinds of words.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, so it could show that it could possibly be an innate feature that all children are born with to use as a tool when approaching their language.
I like it.
And what we've been finding is that even English learning infants at 7 months of age will pick up on these patterns, and not only that, they'll use these patterns to make guesses about word boundaries in the ways that we would predict if they were equipped to use these cues as a word boundary cue. And so this is interesting simply because it shows yet another skill that infants have that could be useful for word segmentation, but it's also interesting in that they didn't have to learn, or they had no opportunity to learn, that for English this is going to be a useful cue. And in fact, it's not going to be a useful cue for English. Nonetheless, they have this propensity. And this actually is in line with a lot of other things we know about early infant speech perception. So there are a lot of sound distinctions that English doesn't make. Okay. And some that I couldn't even produce because I'm just not used to producing those kinds of sounds. But certain sounds that we as English speakers would hear as the same sound, as the same speech sound, say a K, okay, or a D. Whereas certain distinctions are made in other languages where those two sounds would be distinct sound categories, like the distinction between a P and a D in English. Okay, that clearly different. Okay, we as adult speakers of English might not be able to perceive that contrast, but what's interesting is a 7-month-old infant would be able to perceive that contrast. And the idea is, well, they have to be able to perceive things that they might need to be able to distinguish if their language makes a certain contrast. Even though English and the language these 7-month-olds have been exposed to since birth, and even a little in utero, even though that language doesn't make use of vowel harmony, or doesn't have harmony patterns that are associated with word boundaries, infants nonetheless seem to be able to naturally use that information, at least early on. And so future steps now are to look at, one question is whether this ability changes over time, as does infants' ability to perceive the sounds of a language. They get tuned to the language they're learning. Is there a similar kind of tuning process for the sensitivity to harmony patterns? For example, if by 12 months infants have had no reason to believe that their language, that they should pay attention to vowel harmony in their language, will they start to lose the sensitivity to these patterns? So that's one obvious sort of next step, is to see whether there's a developmental time course for this sensitivity and for the ability, or for the use of this pattern in segmenting speech. But then related questions have to do with whether infants learning different languages that have harmony patterns, but that have different kinds of harmony patterns. How early do they start to notice what might be informative for learning their language? What is the learning process? What is the developmental time course for tuning to the particular harmony patterns that a language has? And that will require cross-linguistic work, looking at infants natively learning languages that have different kinds of harmony patterns. But that's another obvious place that this research can go. And what it tells us more broadly is, in some sense, it's sort of basic research about what infants are doing when they're acquiring a language, and it can give us some clues as to what kinds of things we might need to look for when there are cases of language delay. Now, there are many kinds of things that could be interfering there, and this just gives us more information about what is happening during normal development, which could be informative in that area as well.